This is pretty much how every morning starts for me. I sit in the van, it's still kind of dark. I stare at the car. Okay, so I'm just loading up the scan tool. I've just started it and the engine management light came on. So while this is loading, I'm just going to show you a quick shot of when I started it, what came out of the exhaust. Initially I thought that this was just going to be quite a simple starter motor replacement, but I just noticed yesterday, because I've only bought this recently, when I drove it home, it wouldn't start when it was hot, aka when the cooling system is pressurized. But it will start quite relatively easily when it's cold, and there's a lot of white smoke out the exhaust, so I'll show you a clip of that now. On first start up, lots of smoke, lots and lots of smoke. Now I must confess I'm not hugely familiar with these engines. It's just a small petrol engine, so it's relatively simple, but I would assume that this, especially considering it has a little flared end on it, should feed an expansion tank that would be in this void here, but there's nothing there at the moment. So I'm curious as to what's going on with the cooling system here. And I've seen this as well a few times, just down here. Sometimes you can end up with a leak here, or the thermostat's not working properly. Okay, so we have an O2 sensor code stored, which may be related to our potential head gasket leak. Could be totally unrelated, we'll see. So it happened in closed loop, so when the engine was slightly warmer. The engine coolant was still quite cold. Negative fuel trim, so it's that's like, okay. Gives us an indication of what the engine is doing, whether it's subtracting fuel or adding fuel. Okay. So it was when... This may not have been when the engine was driving. This engine won't idle very nicely. Sometimes it sits about 2k RPM, so this code could have been pretty much set at any time. So you can see from the fuel trim correction here, something's definitely not right. The engine's not running right. We're idling at 1600 RPMs, which is very, very high. We've got a fixed... Looks like we have a fixed voltage here on this sensor for the short term. Short term should really oscillate, so it could be a problem with that O2 sensor, and we'll see soon. So due to a number of reasons, mainly the weather, the rain was just so bad, there was loads of stuff that I did on the car that I just couldn't record. So I'll just talk you through it while I managed to get some footage of changing the spark plugs. So the last thing that I did on this car was just a full service, changed all the oil, filters, plugs, leads. I did have a clip, can't remember if I put it earlier in the video, but basically one of the leads was damaged anyway, so that wasn't helping it run right. We had that code for the O2 sensor. That was a bit of a red herring, because you always have to try and figure out, are you getting the code for the sensor because it's working properly and it's notifying you that there's a problem, or is the sensor itself just broken and needs replacing? Well, in this case the O2 sensor was absolutely fine. So the problem with this car, in the code I pointed out that the coolant temperature seemed a bit strange. Well, I ran the car up to temperature, and it always stayed around 6 to 7 degrees, and then you put your hand on the sensor itself in the engine bay, and it would be so hot you know you could barely keep your hand on it. And the other thing that didn't help the car not running right was the thermostat was stuck shut. So for a number of reasons, I'm not really sure what happened to this car. The fact that the expansion tank was missing, I did manage to find one and put that in, but this is like a classic example of where the code is only really part of the story. Basically, without the scan tool, you would never know that the coolant temperature sensor wasn't working properly. So you could figure out the thermostat was stuck. You could replace that, and then you could still have the same problem. And this car did eventually sell. I sold this for £400. I bought it for £50. Including MOTing it, I spent about £200 on it. And probably in total, I think I spent about 3 or 4 hours on the car, maybe. And I had it for, I think almost 2 weeks, just waiting for that expansion tank, really. Obviously, it's very difficult to troubleshoot a cooling system problem when you can't fill up the car properly. But it all ran fine. Unfortunately, the starter motor was also absolutely beasted, just from where it had been hard starting for so long with the coolant temperature sensor not working properly. It had just been a bit worn out, really. Fortunately, it had a new battery just before I got it. So, and other than that, the car runs great. I did think initially that it needed a head gasket just because of the hard starting. The coolant overflowing, the expansion tank missing. I was actually thinking maybe it overpressurized and exploded. That can happen on some cars when they have a bad leak. There's loads of air pockets in the system, and because I couldn't bleed it, I couldn't tell whether it was just air or whether it was exhaust gas. I did put my borescope down inside the cylinders, and they all looked pretty coked up with carbon, but none of them looked like they'd been steam cleaned by coolant, basically, which is why I started to look at other things. At a glance, it seemed to have the appearance of a head gasket, had the code for an O2 sensor, but after all that, it was just the coolant sensor and the thermostat. So, but in the end, it wasn't needed.